So as you're reading about types of agriculture found in developing countries and developed countries, or subsistence versus commercial agriculture, these are the main types you need to know. So there are 11 agricultural regions. These main agricultural regions are spread over the entire world, and there's also an area where agriculture is non-existent. There are 5 agricultural regions present in developing countries. One is pastoral nomadism, shifting cultivation, intensive subsistence with wet rice, intensive subsistence with crops other than rice, and a plantation type of agriculture. The 6 regions that you can find in developed countries today would be mixed crop and livestock, dairy farming, grain farming, ranching, Mediterranean farming, and commercial gardening. So here's the agricultural regions. So you have subsistence agriculture present in these areas here. Pastoral nomadism is prominent in these pale blue areas. Up here you have no agriculture present. And then in these areas you have intensive subsistence with wet rice. And this is intensive subsistence, not rice. Okay, this is white rice, this is not rice. And then in more developed countries, you're going to see things like Mediterranean farming, dairy farming, commercial gardening. And so we'll go over this map in class a bit more. Pastoral nomadism is a form of subsistence agriculture that's based on the herding of domesticated animals. There's lots of different approaches, and many of them combine reliance on some type of like sedentary agriculture with the herding of livestock. But these were traditionally people who were nomadic or practiced transhumanescence. So some of them get grain from sedentary farmers. Some of them are less nomadic than they used to and might grow their own grain today. Sometimes women and children might stay at a fixed location while the men move around with the crops. And or today they might hire workers to practice a sedentary agriculture while they move around with their animals. There are many different types of animals that are used in this pastoral nomadism or transhumanescence, and so it depends on where you are living. And so here you see donkeys. There are places where you might do it with llamas. Cattle is a common one. In some areas, it might be goats, sheep. So the type of animal depends on really where you're at in the world. Shifting cultivation is characterized by 2 distinctive features. Farmers are going to clear land for planting by slashing vegetation and burning the debris. And then the farmers grow the crops on the cleared field for only a few years until the soil nutrients are depleted. Then they leave it fallow for many years so the soil can recover. And they might return to a site 6 years later or 20 years later. The land is usually owned by the entire village or tribe. But today, some individuals own land, especially in Latin America. And you're going to find shifting cultivation in areas like the rainforest. This is not like slash and burn agriculture, where like large corporations come in, burn down acres and acres and acres of rainforest, and then put a plantation in there instead. The rainforest is never able to take over that land. These are people who are clearing maybe a land the size of like a backyard or a little bit bigger, growing plants there for a few years, and then it's easily taken over by the rainforest again. So this is a sustainable sort of farming, and again, subsistence means really growing food for like one person. So here is a group of people practicing subsistence shifting agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. Intensive subsistence farming. These are people who are working intensively on a piece of land to grow a lot of crops. Most of the work is done by hand or by animals. They don't have a lot of machines. And they use all the land possible to produce the food they need. These parcels of land are smaller than elsewhere in the world because they are still growing food for themselves, and maybe if they have extra, they sell some. This feeds about 3/4 of the world's people who live in developing countries. The biggest example, and most common example, is wet rice, and that's when people are planting rice. So these are the places that produce the most rice in the world. And here's an example of that intensive labor. So him and the water buffalo are plowing the land. And so he's walking behind him as he does it. It takes a lot more work, physical labor, than sitting on a tractor. Here are some rice fields. So they plant the rice, and once it sprouts and grows, and they move it to these flooded fields or terraced gardens. And we'll talk about terracing in a little bit. And then it grows up. Rice is, like all grains, related to grass. So it's distantly related to corn and wheat and all the other grains. So all the grains are descended from grass. We also have, so wet rice is going to be dominant in southeastern China, East India, and most of Southeast Asia. There are portions where you cannot grow wet rice if the summer precipitation levels are too low or the winters are too harsh, because most varieties take about 18 to 24 months to fully mature. Commercial, we also have non-rice dominant, and that would be if you were growing wheat or corn or sweet potatoes or yams or potatoes or any other crop that's not rice. It would be practiced the same way as that intensive rice agriculture, just not with the same crop. In developed countries, we have the rest of the agricultural regions. So commercial agriculture was divided up into 6 main types. And most of these fall under something called agribusiness, which is what we're watching a documentary about right now, right, with Food Inc. Agribusiness is used to refer to those types of farming that are used in a developed country, because the point of this farming isn't to grow food for your family. It's really meant to be sold into a larger scale food production industry. So mixed crop and livestock farming is when people have, maybe you're growing a lot of corn, but you also have on your property, maybe cattle or chicken. In this integration, the corn you're growing isn't really for human consumption. You're really growing stuff to either to feed to your animals or to sell to make into animal feed. Most of the income is probably going to come from the sale of animal products, but you're going to devote a lot of your land to growing crops. This is going to allow farmers to distribute the workload more evenly throughout the year, because the crops are going to require less attention than the animals on a day-to-day basis, aside, of course, from when you're planting the seeds and when you're harvesting them. And it usually involves something called crop rotation, which is the practice of rotating the use of different fields from crop to crop each year to avoid exhausting the soil. So here's somebody harvesting a field of wheat. Another type of agriculture in developed regions would be dairy farming. This is one of the most important types of commercial agriculture in the first ring outside large cities because of transportation factors. The area in which a dairy farmer will sell their milk product is usually referred to as the milk shed. And even though we have advances in technology, we have refrigerated cars, most of your milk still comes from an area within about 500 kilometers. So if you look on a milk carton, it has a code on it, and you can type it into this Where's My Milk From website. I'll put it on Google Classroom. And you can see where the milk you're drinking, where it was produced. And we get a lot of our milk here from other places in Florida. Most dairy farmers sell their milk to wholesalers who then distribute it to retailers. And then they sell them to consumers in shops or in homes. Milk production worldwide is on the rise. So there are places that traditionally didn't have a lot of milk, like places in East Asia, who today are drinking more milk. We also have something called commercial gardening and fruit farming, and this is the predominant type of farming here in southeast the U.S., so in Florida. It's also called truck farming. This comes from the Middle English word truck, meaning to barter or exchange. So we talk about commercial gardening and fruit farming. We're talking about growing things like tomatoes and apples and asparagus and cherries and lettuce and mushrooms and potatoes and green peppers and pineapples, oranges, mangoes, any of these fruits and vegetables that you can't harvest as quickly as you would grain. So in Florida, we grow a lot of tomatoes. We grow a lot of citrus. We grow a lot of bell peppers, pineapple. But we also in Florida have sugar cane, which would be harvested a bit more like the grains. And then we also have lots of corn grown here in Florida and lots of rice. So most of the fruits and vegetables are sold fresh to consumers, but some are sold to large processors for canning or freezing. Truck farms are highly efficient, large scale operations that take advantage of machines at any stage they can. Um, but when they can't use machines, they still have a lot of work that's done by hand by migrant farm workers. So a lot of strawberry harvesting is still done by migrant farm workers. And usually, if you are doing commercial gardening, you specialize in a few crops, but you don't do a huge range of them because it's easier to manage just a few at a time. Grain farming is when you're growing the grain crop just for human consumption. So in the U.S., our biggest ones here would be wheat and corn. The farms are going to sell their output to manufacturers of food products, people who make breakfast cereals and bread and sell things like flour. The characteristics of a typical grain farm would be that it's got lots of machinery, it farms in a large area, and it's oriented to customer preferences. Mediterranean agriculture is going to be areas near a sea, and they're going to be usually on the west coast of continents because they need a moderate winter climate. They need a little bit of extra moisture, but in general, they're fairly dry areas. So places like Italy, Greece, Morocco, and California all have Mediterranean agriculture. And in Mediterranean agriculture, we're going to be looking at things like olives and grapes. So here's a picture of some Mediterranean farms in Greece. Ranching is commercial grazing of livestock over an extensive area, and we've seen some of that in Food Inc. already. Those are feedlots, so those are large, giant feedlots. There's also like grass-fed cattle and more traditional ranching practices. Usually, in developed countries, you have lots of ranching where you wouldn't have a lot of crops growing. So out west, you have a lot of it. Um, so in places like Wyoming, where the growing season would be too short to do a lot of like grain harvesting, they also have a lot of ranching out there. And today, the ranching has become a part of the meat processing industry where new methods of breeding and sources of water and feed are embraced. And here is more of a like a grass fed kind of ranching. And that's about it for today.